Imagine yourself sitting beside a crackling campfire 15,000 years before Christ. No YouTube, no smartphones, no overflowing inbox with 99 plus unread messages waiting for your attention. The world is nothing more than you, the glowing fire, and thick ribbons of smoke drifting slowly into your face. Then, at some forgotten moment in history, one of our ancestors stares into that swirling smoke and has a strange thought. Wait, what if I breathed it in on purpose? This is the story of how humanity discovered smoke. Not cigarettes, not expensive cigars, and certainly not office workers standing outside trading gossip during a smoke break. We are talking about the very first time in history that a human being deliberately inhaled something rising from a fire, and why that strange decision became one of the oldest habits our species has ever known. Because there is one remarkable truth that almost nobody ever tells you. Smoking did not begin with tobacco. It did not begin with colonial trade routes. It did not begin with Native American ceremonies. In fact, it may even be older than agriculture itself. The urge to breathe in smoke seems to be buried somewhere deep inside our biology. So deep that it may reach back to a time before the dawn of civilization. And the evidence for that idea is far stranger than you would ever expect. Let's begin with fire. The oldest confirmed evidence that our ancestors learned to control it dates back about 1 million years. Inside a place known as Wonder Work Cave in South Africa. There, archaeologists uncovered layers of ancient plant ash and charred animal bones. This was not the aftermath of a natural wildfire. It was a fire that had been deliberately built, tended, and kept alive deep inside the cave. 1 million years ago. Our ancestors were not even modern humans yet. They were Homo erectus. Distant cousins with smaller brains, heavier brows, and one personality trait that has never really disappeared. They did not like being told what to do. They gathered around the fire just as we still do today. They cooked, they kept warm, they sat together while darkness surrounded them, and they breathed the smoke day after day, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. People sitting beside those fires would have inhaled smoke, sometimes by accident, sometimes intentionally. There was simply no avoiding it. In a way, smoke was the standard air quality of prehistoric life. And of course, for Shem, there was no app around to warn anyone about pollution. But this is where the story starts to become fascinating. Smoke from a campfire is far more than burning wood. Whenever you burn any organic material, you are not just producing carbon dioxide and water vapor, you are releasing an incredibly complex mixture of chemicals. And that mixture depends entirely on what is burning. Remarkably, when certain plants burn, they release naturally occurring neuroactive compounds, including alkaloids and terpenes, chemicals capable of interacting with the human nervous system in surprisingly powerful ways. In other words, some of our ancestors may have accidentally found themselves feeling calmer, lighter, even mildly euphoric while sitting beside a fire, without having the slightest idea why. This is not just speculation. For decades, researchers have pointed out that early humans living in forests were constantly surrounded by smoke from naturally occurring psychoactive plants, including cannabis, wild Nicotiana species, and many other plants containing mind-altering compounds that once grew across Africa, Europe, and Asia. It turns out the human brain contains specialized receptors that respond to cannabinoids. Those receptors did not evolve because of cannabis. They are part of our own endocannabinoid system, an ancient biological network that helps regulate everything from mood and memory to appetite. Yet the receptors are there. which means that the first time a human inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant, the brain was not confused. It did not reject the experience. It was almost as if the brain quietly smiled and said, "Oh, hello, I've been waiting for you." That moment, the very first accidental breath of psychoactive smoke beside a campfire, may have been the true beginning of smoking. It was not a rational decision. It was not a carefully planned experiment. It was simply a pleasant accident, repeated often enough that eventually someone wondered, what if we could make this happen again on purpose? Pause for a second and think about that. An entire global tobacco industry worth trillions of dollars, centuries of rituals, shamanic ceremonies, traditional medicine, all of it may trace its origins back to one exhausted hunter sitting downwind from an ordinary bush and purely by chance, having an unexpectedly wonderful evening. History can be beautiful in the strangest ways. By now, you are probably wondering something. If this really happened, where is the evidence? Why have we not found ancient smoking tools from that distant past? Does their absence mean none of this ever happened? Or does it simply mean we have not found them yet? Remember this. Organic materials rarely survive for thousands of years underground. Seeds, leaves, plant fibers, wood, they disappear. We can still uncover stone tools made 3 million years ago because stone is incredibly durable. But a wooden pipe packed with dried herbs would decay within centuries. A leather pouch filled with cannabis would return to the earth long before any archaeologist could ever discover it. The absence of physical evidence does not automatically make this idea wrong. Sometimes history disappears long before anyone is around to preserve it. And what about the story told by Herodotus? In the 5th century before Christ, the ancient Greek historian gave a remarkably detailed account of the Scythians, the nomadic people who roamed the vast Eurasian steppes. He described a ritual that he compared to a steam bath. They built small enclosed tents, heated stones until they glowed red, scattered hemp seeds onto the hot rocks, then climbed inside and breathed in the smoke. Herodotus wrote that they became so overwhelmed with pleasure that they shouted with joy. For centuries, later historians dismissed the story as an exaggeration. Then archaeologists began excavating Scythian burial mounds. What they found was astonishing. Bronze braziers, fire-heated stones, and chemical traces of hemp. Exactly as Herodotus had described. It turned out he had not exaggerated at all. If anything, he had probably understated the experience. This is where the story enters territory that most documentaries never even mention, because almost nobody asks the next question. What happened to all the psychoactive plants that did not survive today? We know about cannabis, we know about tobacco, we know about psychedelic mushrooms, but once upon a time, there may have been dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of mind-altering plants that our ancestors used regularly. Now they are gone, extinct, erased from the living world, forgotten almost completely. And that may be one of the most important parts of this entire story. Think about it this way. Every psychoactive plant that still exists today survived because humans chose to preserve it. Perhaps it was useful, perhaps it was profitable, or perhaps it was gentle enough to become part of large-scale trade. But the plants that were too powerful, too specialized, or too sacred to be turned into everyday commodities may never have made it through history. They disappeared alongside the cultures that once revered them, taking with them the knowledge of how they were prepared, how they were used, and why they mattered. We did not just lose the plants themselves. We may have lost entire systems of medicine, along with completely different ways of understanding what the human mind is capable of experiencing. Now let's talk about tobacco, the plant most people immediately think of when they hear the word smoking. And this is the part of the story that almost nobody knows. The tobacco your ancestors encountered was nothing like the cigarettes sold today. Wild Nicotiana, the ancestor of modern tobacco, contained nicotine in concentrations so powerful that a single session could trigger vomiting, vivid hallucinations, or even unconsciousness. Indigenous shamans in South America used doses that would probably send the average modern smoker straight to the emergency room. This was never an everyday habit. It was a serious spiritual tool, reserved for extraordinary purposes. So what changed? Why does the tobacco you can buy at almost any convenience store today feel nothing like what the ancient Maya shamans once experienced? The answer lies in centuries of selective breeding, driven almost entirely by profit. Tobacco was domesticated, then domesticated again. Generation after generation, growers intentionally made it milder, smoother, and far less overwhelming. Because the weaker the tobacco became, the more often people could smoke it. The more often they smoked, the more they bought. What you hold in your hand today is only a faint, carefully domesticated shadow of a plant that was once astonishingly wild. That wildness was systematically bred out of it, because truly wild things cannot be mass-produced. But here's the question that might keep you awake tonight. If tobacco was once powerful enough to induce hallucinations, and humans deliberately weakened it to sell it to more people, what does that tell us about the countless other products we consume every day? The story of tobacco is not really about tobacco at all. It reveals what happens whenever something becomes a commodity. When the only question driving the market is no longer, what is this for? But how can we make people consume more of it? Let me share with you an idea that sounds almost unbelievable, yet has been taken seriously by respected anthropologists. It is known as the intoxication hypothesis. Across the world, nearly every documented human culture has discovered ways to alter its state of consciousness. People fermented drinks, they ate psychedelic mushrooms, they inhaled smoke, they chewed leaves, they swallowed seeds. This behavior appears so consistently in societies separated by vast oceans and continents that many researchers believe it cannot be a coincidence. Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, proposed that the drive to alter consciousness may be humanity's fourth biological need, alongside hunger, thirst, and sex. He argued that this impulse is rooted deep within biology itself and is not unique to humans. Look at nature itself. Elephants deliberately search for fermented marula fruit to become intoxicated. Reindeer in Siberia have been observed eating the psychedelic mushroom Amanita muscaria. Even more astonishing, other reindeer sometimes drink the urine of those that have eaten the mushrooms, because the psychoactive compounds can pass through the body largely unchanged. In other words, reindeer in Siberia have figured out how to recycle their intoxicants. Nature is often far stranger than we imagine. And that leads to an important conclusion. If the desire to alter consciousness is truly this ancient and this deeply rooted, then it becomes entirely reasonable to imagine that long before pottery, long before pipes, early humans deliberately exposed themselves to the smoke of psychoactive plants. They learned through experience, sometimes through life and death. Perhaps they even chose campsites near certain plants for exactly this reason. They discovered which smoke brought calm, which smoke brought unbearable suffering, and which plants existed on the razor-thin line between expanding the mind and ending a life. This was survival in its purest prehistoric form. The risks were enormous. Sometimes, quite literally, people paid with their lives. But those who survived remembered what happened. They told others, over countless generations. They built an immense body of knowledge that was never written down, only lived. There were no libraries, no schools, just experience passed from one generation to the next around a campfire in the darkness. That is how most human knowledge was preserved throughout the vast majority of our history. Here is another fact that rarely appears in ordinary conversations. Long before inhaling smoke became recreational, and even before it became spiritual, it was medical. The Eber's Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, dating to around 1550 before Christ in ancient Egypt, describes treatments in which patients inhaled smoke from heated herbs to relieve diseases of the throat and lungs. You heard that correctly. Ancient Egyptians treated lung conditions by breathing in smoke. It sounds completely backwards today. But many of the herbs they used, including thornapple and other medicinal plants, contain powerful pharmacological compounds that become active when heated and inhaled. The delivery method was not irrational. It was simply centuries ahead of its time. Smoke travels directly into the lungs. So if a plant contains medicinal compounds, delivering those compounds through inhalation makes remarkable medical sense. The lungs act as an incredibly fast drug delivery system. In many ways, we still rely on the same principle today with asthma inhalers, anesthetic gases, and nebulizers. Fortunately, we have mostly eliminated the burning part. Ancient Ayurvedic medicine in India, with a history stretching back more than 3,000 years, also described a therapy known as dhumapana, literally meaning drinking smoke, in which patients inhaled medicinal herbs through specially prepared pipes. This was never a random folk remedy. It was a sophisticated medical system, refined over centuries through careful observation and experience. And here is one final piece of the puzzle that almost nobody talks about: the oldest archaeological evidence we have for the deliberate use of tobacco. In 2019, researchers made a remarkable discovery at a site in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert. They uncovered the remains of a campfire dating back about 12,300 years, containing seeds from Nicotiana attenuata, a species of wild tobacco native to North America. Those seeds could not have been blown into the fire by chance. They had been deliberately gathered and placed there. Think about what that means. 12,300 years ago. Before pottery, before agriculture, before any civilization you ever learned about in school. If people were deliberately placing tobacco into fires 12,300 years ago in North America, what were people elsewhere doing with the psychoactive plants growing around them at exactly the same time? By 12,000 years ago, humans had already spread across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. The desire to explore altered states of consciousness was never uniquely American. It was something far older, a deeply rooted instinct shared by our entire species. And that brings us to perhaps the deepest part of this entire story. Something ancient people understood instinctively, while modern science is only beginning to understand. A circle of people gathered around ritual smoke was never just a form of entertainment, it was social infrastructure. Modern neuroscience has shown that shared rituals can synchronize brain activity between participants, measurably increase trust, and strengthen a group's shared identity. When an ancient community gathered inside an enclosed space, inhaled the smoke of burning herbs, and entered an altered state of consciousness together, they were not simply performing a ceremony, They were using one of humanity's earliest social technologies. It was how a tribe built absolute trust, the kind of trust that allowed them to walk together into danger and come home together alive. So, when did ancient humans actually begin smoking? The honest answer is this: we do not know, and perhaps we never will. The oldest physical evidence takes us back about 12,300 years, but the behaviors that made smoking possible, the desire to alter consciousness, to share ritual experiences, and to deliberately inhale meaningful substances almost certainly reach much farther into the past than any artifact we will ever uncover. They may be as old as fire itself, as old as the cognitive revolution that shaped us into the humans we are today. The ability to connect cause and effect, to watch a plant burn and think. The last time that happened, I felt different. Let's do it again. That is not addiction. That is intelligence. What is unmistakably clear is that this behavior existed long before agriculture, long before pottery, and long before the first civilizations ever appeared. By the time written history emerged in different parts of the world, humans had already been finding ways to inhale smoke for countless generations. The plants changed, the rituals evolved, the reasons varied from place to place. Yet the behavior itself had become an ancient part of what it meant to be human long before anyone thought to write it down. There is something almost poetic hidden inside this story. Fire, smoke, breath. The earliest humans gathered around their campfires and breathed the same drifting smoke that you might smell beside a fire tonight. At some forgotten moment in the distant past, someone noticed that rising smoke, chose to follow it, and passed that choice on to their children. Those children passed it to theirs. And the thread continued, unbroken, from the first prehistoric campfire all the way to this very moment. To you, wherever you happen to be watching these words, in one way or another, you are still doing what humans have always done since the dawn of our story.